with some. I'm very pleased to take a call on this bill that the opposition is opposing so strongly, because it really cuts to the heart of what divides us as parties in this House. The principles on which the ACC scheme was established were basically, one of them was that we gave up the right to litigate in order that we would be able to have a scheme that stood by us and supported us when we had an accident. The whole point about this bill is it undermines that contract. It undermines our ability to be able to get the sort of assistance and sort of support that we need when we have an accident. That's the sort of message that's coming through the doors of my office when I meet my constituents in Mount Albert. Mr Boscawen, as the Honourable Annette King spoke of, said that the whole point about ACC is we're paying more and getting less, and that's exactly what this bill aims to do. That further undermines that contract that we have with New Zealanders out there who expect us to stand up and to defend a system which gives them the right for proper compensation and proper support when they have an accident. The other thing that's a principle on which this AC scheme is based is that it spreads risk. No matter what we do in our society, whether we are a timber worker, whether we are a factory worker, or whether we work in a more benign office environment, we all pay an amount which means that we all get supported and we all receive the same sort of compensation, so that we don't end up like in other countries, like in Australia or other places, where if you want to take your kids to school sport or something like that, you actually need to pay more to ensure that their accidents are covered should they have one. The passage of this bill is moving more towards the privatisation and the undermining of those principles. And why is it that we are here in terms of putting this bill through, to pay more and to get less? Well, frankly, because the Minister of ACC is saying that the ACC is technically insolvent and going down the gurgler. What a lot of nonsense. What a lot of nonsense. It completely misrepresents the definition of what insolvency actually is. And that's been picked up by so many of the commentators who understand and have an understanding of what ACC does in New Zealand. Rod Oram, for example, last year noted there is a huge gap between the rhetoric of John Key and Smith and reality. That's what he said. An actuary, somebody who actually is an expert on insurance and on claims, Jonathan Erickson of Erickson and Associates said, quote, "All this talk of liabilities being blown out is complete nonsense. It's ill-founded and smacks of scaremongering, which, given the current economic picture, is the last thing people need to be told." We're talking this up, and people out there in New Zealand are starting to believe, unfortunately, that this is a scheme which can no longer be affordable for New Zealand, when actually that is not the truth at all. And that justification is being used to ram through this piece of legislation, which will mean that New Zealanders pay more and get much less. A respected journalist in the New Zealand Herald, Brian Fallow, this is what he says last year: "For the government to wrap legitimate concerns about slippage in ACC's performance in a whole lot of shrill scaremongering and scapegoating is gratuitous. Indeed, it is downright irresponsible when talking about the scheme to use terms like insolvent and going down the gurgler, even if the context is counterfactual, because there are people who are dependent on it to keep body and soul together and will do so for the rest of their lives." That is exactly the contract that we established ACC for. It is exactly the contract on which New Zealanders gave up the right to litigate their accidents, to give massive amounts of profit Mr. Chair?
David Shearer.
To give massive amounts of profit to lawyers, as they do in other countries, to have a scheme which will support and which they will be able to depend on. This scheme, as many of my fellow party members have spoken on, is a very good value scheme. And we heard from Pete Hodgson just before about the comparisons with Australia. Let's look at what it costs in Australia. This is the rate per $100 in Australian earnings. New Zealanders pay 0.94. South Australia pays $3.14. The average Australian payment is $1.73. In other words, our scheme for employers is about half of what it costs Australian employers. It kind of surprises me, therefore, that if employers are paying so little for the New Zealand scheme, and I'm assuming that they're aware of it, that why a government which proposes to support and be supported by businesses and New Zealand businesses might want to go down this particular track and increase the amount of levies that employers pay for accidents for their workers. The other part, and the last part that I want to speak on, Mr. Chair, is just exactly how unfair many of the clauses in this bill is. We heard about, the Honourable Ruth Dyson talked about pre-accident earnings, asking workers who were on a high income to come back to work earlier and to accept a job at a lower level. They have been paying legitimately their contribution to ACC. They have outgoings in their household that are at a certain level. They expect, under the contract that we have with New Zealanders have with ACC, that they will be able to come back. They will be able to get the proper support and to maintain their households without going into economic deprivation. This pre-accident earnings clause does not fair. It is simply not fair. Holiday pay. Grant Robertson mentioned this as well. This is grossly unfair. It means that if I am fortuitously able to have an accident just the first day back from my holidays, having used up my annual leave, I will not be penalised by having to sacrifice my holidays. But if I just happen to be saving my holidays and have an accident the day before I go on holiday, I will lose those holidays for ACC. This is a basic right of New Zealanders to have holidays. It is mean-spirited, and I would contest Mr. Peachey's claim that this was not mean-spirited, that this bill is being set up to be far more to enable the ACC to be sustainable and affordable. It's simply not. This particular clause will cost $1 million. Now, fairness, as I would argue, all New Zealanders are fair people. They want a fair go. They want their ACC to be fair. They want it to be fair on all people. They want to be able to pay a levy and know that their kids can go out and play sport, and if they have an accident, they will be able to be compensated. That workers in a high-risk occupation are going to be compensated in the same way that people in low risk. And yet we get this sort of clause 58, relating to holiday pay, being grossly unfair and unjust. This, Mr. Chair, is a bill which, as Mr. Boscawen quite accurately said, is one in which we will be paying more and getting less. And all this bill does, Mr. Chair, is to simply reinforce what Mr. Boscawen was arguing it shouldn't do. And for that reason, Mr. Speaker, and in conclusion, I think that it is completely right that the Labour Party stands up here and defends a bill by which New Zealanders have entered